welcome to our next webinar, To ID or Not to ID. We're going to be going through some introductory information into how to tell plants and animals apart. So my name is Alexa, and I'm here with my coworker Jamie, and we have a really exciting presentation for you all today. Okay, so I'm located here in the Nature House, and the Nature House is located in Esquimalt Gorge Park. So the Esquimalt Gorge Park has had a vastly changing and really diverse history through time. The park is part of the traditional and unceded territories of the Lukungan-speaking peoples, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. So they, with other First Nations groups, such as the Wasanich and Suk peoples, have historical and current relationships with the land that continue to this day. So prior to European settlement, the Lukungan peoples used Gorge Waterway for fishing, hunting, and travel. So the Gorge Waterway is this area here shown in this image where the Nature House and Esquimalt Gorge Park is. Gorge Waterway was referred to as Chemosac. So here's a link to learn more about the Lukungan-speaking peoples, their history, their culture, and the important work that they do today.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of it before, GWAS stands for the Gorge Waterway Action Society. It's a charity organization that's focused on education and environmental stewardship in and around the Gorge Waterway. So the primary hub of the GWAS is, like Alexa said, the Gorge Waterway Nature House in Esquimalt Gorge Park. It's the primary focal point for both the park and the mission of GWAS. GWAS participates actively to contribute to the health of the Esquimalt Gorge Park and that of the community that surrounds the park through community events, cleanups, restoration, volunteer, and youth involvement. Alexa and I are recent graduates of UVic's biology undergrad program, and we're part of a youth community partnership program, which allows young professionals such as ourselves to gain exciting experience under the supervision of skilled professionals. So with its valued partners, such as World Fisheries Trust, the Gorge Waterway Initiative, and a bunch of municipal groups, GWAS has maintained a holistic, determined, and steadfast commitment to the health of the Gorge Waterway and of the community surrounding it. What is species identification? Can anyone tell us what species identification is? Okay, so yeah, species identification. It's when you want to figure out what a species is, and then you can determine a bit more about them. So who they're related to, when they evolved, and what makes them unique as a species. There's a specific type of science that looks at this, and that's called taxonomy. So some species identifications can be done by just someone in their own backyard. A big part of many scientists and environmental experts' jobs is to use that species identification to know what they're looking at. Species identification involves looking at the animal's biology, its appearance, their habitat, and their behavior. Sometimes, though, it isn't enough, and scientists need to use more complex tools like, microscopes and genetic testing. They got to look really, really specific at all those little things about an animal. Because a lot of species might look alike, and the world has about 8.7 million different species. We've found an estimated about 1/5 of this amount. So we don't have any idea really how many species there are, because so many look super alike in their biology and their evolution, or they're in remote locations like super deep in the ocean where we've never gotten to. Also, the definition of species is argued upon. So, one scientist might say that's one species, and another scientist is going to come along and say, no, that's not. But so we're just working on it. We've got a lot going on. It's a big, broad area, and there's a lot to think about.
Okay, so how do we even begin to tell species apart? There are so many animals that may look alike to us. So scientists have created a really great solution. It's called a dichotomous key. It's a big word, so if you can't pronounce it, that's okay. We'll pronounce it for you. A dichotomous key is a useful tool for scientists or anyone else like you or me to identify a plant or animal based on things that we can observe on the animal or the plant. Dichotomous key helps us to organize big groups of species that might be confusing otherwise. And we then come up with small bite-sized chunks. So we can address what a species is step by step. It makes it very easy. Each step of the dichotomous key has 2 selections, which is where its name comes from. So each step of this key has 2 selections, like I mentioned, and each selection leads us to knowing, to further knowing who the species or what the organism is. This is a very simple version of a key. So we can see here that we're trying to figure out where a human fits in. So our first question in the key, because even humans have their own group, does it have thumbs? So we say yes. Is it mostly hairless? Yeah, we've got some hair on our head, but I mean, we're pretty much hairless. So we're going to go, yes, likely a human. Look at that. We have found ourselves. So most dichotomous keys are a lot more complicated, but this is a really good example of a really simple dichotomous key. So they help us to get as close as we can to the true creature without, further genetic testing. So dichotomous keys look at 2 types of observations: qualitative, which is a big word for just saying features that we can see, like color or a pattern, maybe the stripes on a tiger. And it also looks at numbers of things. So this could be the number of legs on a type of bug or insect. Okay, so before we get further into some specific species, I'm going to ask everyone, what is your favorite animal or plant? Do you have a favorite animal or plant? Do you want to learn about an animal or plant? What interests you? Maybe you like whales or flowers, jellyfish. So there is a lot of life in the world. There's a lot of different kinds of life. There are many different categories that scientists have put animals and plants and fungi and all these sorts of things into. So we're going to look at some of these major groups, 3 major groups. So most of us know plants, animals, and some of us may know about fungi. So fungi is made up of a bunch of different little creatures, but some of them aren't even that little. Some of them are just mushrooms. I'm sure many of you know mushrooms. So we belong to one of these groups. We belong to the animal kingdom. And the plants make up all of our habitats, our beautiful forests, our meadows, our prairies, our riverbanks. So all of these groups are very large. In every form of life, there are these tiny compartments that make up each being, and these are called cells. So cells contain very small parts that are almost like a cell's own organs, and they help the cell to perform its daily functions. You have cells, I have cells, fungi have cells, plants have cells, other animals have cells, we all have cells. To see these, you usually have to look through a microscope. I'm sure we all know many plants, but they're very diverse. They're very different from each other. We can see them in grasses, trees, shrubs, flowers, herbs, grains, and many other kinds. So plants actually use energy from the sun. Some of you probably have heard the term photosynthesis before. This means that plants can gather their own food from the sun and from water, and they can create energy. They are the base of the entire food chain. There are lots of animals that need plants to survive. All animals actually need plants to survive. So plants also need nutrients from the soil. They need a little bit more than the sunlight and the water too. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but usually we'll see a stem or a trunk, flowers, berries or fruits like the flower here, leaves or needles, and some form of a root system. Usually we can't see that on most plants, but some plants we can. So in plants, those cells that we talked about, they're square, whereas in animal cells, these are round. But they're very small, so we can't often see this. Fungi is also an interesting group. Some of us like to eat fungi, but of course you have to be very careful because some fungi is poisonous. Different types of fungi are molds, mushrooms, yeasts. So it can be used in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's really harmful. It can cause disease or it can cause issues with buildings or farmers' crops. But sometimes we really like to use it. So in yeasts, we use that to make bread. Blue cheese has natural mold in it. So fungi, there are a bunch of different types of fungi, but one of the most common is of course these mushrooms. Mushrooms are just the fruit coming off from the filaments that are buried deep under the ground. Animals, I'm sure they're very familiar to all of us. They're very diverse. Animals can be divided into many groups that we're going to discuss. To be an animal, you have to be a living organism, of course. You have to be made up of more than one cell. So many of those little cells we talked about, you have to have lots of them, and they have to be different. So you have to have different types of cells in order to be an animal. You can't just have one type of cell. And these cells do different functions. They help an animal to survive in different ways. So an example of an animal, even though they look very different from us, are things even like sea anemones or spiders. So animals don't just have to be things like dogs and cats or the animals that we know really well.
All right. So we all know about animals. Let's talk about them a bit more. Everybody loves them. You want to talk about them. So there's a variety of different groups of animals, and you might know some. You might know them. You might have favorites. As you can see, we've got a list here. It starts from the smallest of little bugs, gets all the way up to the biggest of the whales. So how do you start to classify all this big variety of animals in the world? So they're grouped based on their evolutionary history. So it's kind of how they came into being. For example, a shark might look kind of like a dolphin, but a dolphin is actually more related to a human than it is to a fish. So a shark's tail and the dolphin's tail are similar. They both help them to swim through the water. And they are analogous structures. That just means they kind of look the same. So because dolphins and humans, for example, live in different places, we develop different bodies to make it more effective for us to live in our respective environments. These structures that are similar, they're called homologous structures. An example would be our hand. So we've got these bones in our hand, and if you were to compare that to the flipper of a dolphin, you'd see the same type of bones in there, despite the fact that, you know, we're using them for totally different things. So our most important first step in determining what animal we're looking at is determining the difference between what's a vertebrate and what's an invertebrate. So to solve that question, it's one of the easiest questions we're going to get today. So a vertebrate is just a creature that has a backbone, and an invertebrate is one that doesn't have one. So you think about a jellyfish or like an insect, they don't have bones in there. Some organisms have bones, but on the outside of their bodies, that's called an exoskeleton. So if you're thinking about maybe a lobster or a beetle, they've got that hard outer shell. That's their form of bones, but it doesn't count towards being a vertebrate or an invertebrate. If you want to, you can reach back. You can feel your own backbones. Those are your vertebrae. The vertebrae are the tiny ridges along your back, and that's where the term vertebrate comes from. They're called vertebrae. So even though vertebrates, the ones with bones, they are a diverse group of many different types of animals, that's the one thing they all have in common, is they all have a backbone. All right, so now we're gonna get you to pick your favorite group of creatures. I want you to either jot it down or keep it in your head, and we're gonna run through and see if we can guess your creatures based on a dichotomous key.
We're going to use our very own key. So we'll give you a couple moments. Perfect. Does everyone have their creatures ready? Yes? Okay. So do you all remember when we talked about backbones? We just mentioned it in vertebrates and invertebrates. So if those words are too hard, you can say backbone creatures or no backbone creatures. That's an easy way to tell them apart too. This is our first question in our dichotomous key. Here are two examples to help clarify if anybody's confused. These sheep, they have a very defined back. They definitely have a backbone. They have a very rigid skeleton that helps hold them up. But the starfish doesn't really have a backbone. Therefore, the sheep are vertebrates like us, and the sea star is an invertebrate. It does not have a backbone. Does your creature, what do you think? Does your creature have a backbone or does it not have a backbone? Let's get a little bit more specific. So if the animal that you chose does not have a backbone, look to the left. If your animal does have a backbone, look to the right. The next question for each of you, for those that picked no backbone, now you have to think about, does it have 6 legs? If it has less than 6 legs, if it has more than 6 legs, or if it has no legs, then you're going to say no. If you look on the right, for the backbone creatures, I'm going to ask you if your animal lays eggs. So think about yes or no if you think your animal lays eggs. Your answer is actually very near. Okay, so now we have some more information. If you said yes to your creature having 6 legs, then you probably have an insect. Congratulations. An insect is an invertebrate with 6 legs. Exactly. So if you have an invertebrate that has more, less, or no legs, then you probably have some other creature. And we're going to talk about some other creatures. This could be later on in the presentation. This is why saying a bug is an insect or an insect is a bug is very broad. So not every bug is an insect. There are over 1 million or more types of insects. So certainly we cannot cover all of our insects today. For those of you that had the backbone creatures, we're going to go back to the eggs. So if your animal does not have eggs, does not lay eggs, you probably have a mammal. So think about us, we're humans, we do not lay eggs, and we are a mammal. So congratulations for those of you that have found a mammal. Mammals have a few key characteristics that are unique to them. Mammals have a backbone, of course, we know this. They breathe air, as we all do. They grow hair at some point in their life, and they have lactation tissue to feed milk to their young. So some very important mammal characteristics. But some of you are not done yet. So if your creature does lay eggs, we have to keep going. So last question, for those that said yes to the last question, meaning you have an egg layer, the next question is, does your animal have wings? If your animal has wings, then you probably have a bird. Congratulations. This bird here is called a house sparrow. Birds are known for their wings, of course, in place of their frontal limbs. So they don't have arms, they have wings instead. They also have beaks on the front of their face. Many of them can fly, but not all of them. Things like penguins and ostriches cannot fly, but some of them are very good runners or very good swimmers. For those of you whose animals do not have wings, who's not a bird, we have to keep going. We have a few more questions for you. Okay, if you said that your animal does not have wings, we have another question for you. Does your animal live in water? So think about it really deeply, yes or no. For both yes and no, if your animal lives in water or not, we're going to keep going together. So if you answered no to your animal living in water, you probably have a reptile. Congratulations. Reptiles breathe air, they have a backbone, and they are cold-blooded. One other thing that makes them special is they have special skin, made up of scales, bony plates, or both. This group is over 350 million years old, so reptiles have been here a very long time. Think about the dinosaurs. For those of you that do not have a reptile, we have one more question. If your animal lives in the water, can it walk on land? So we have 2 types of creatures on this slide. If you say yes, your animal does live in the water and it walks on land, then you probably have an amphibian. Amphibians are a lot like reptiles, but they do have a few differences. They are also cold-blooded, and they may lay eggs like some reptiles. Their skin is smooth and slimy and not rough like a reptile skin. They can also sometimes breathe through their skin, which is quite cool. For those of you that said your animal can't walk on land, it's stuck in the water its whole life, then you probably have a fish, because when we think of fish, they swim. They swim in lakes, they swim in rivers, they swim in oceans. Fish live exclusively in water and breathe through gills in the sides of their head. They don't have lungs like land creatures do. Awesome. Congratulations. I hope some of you have found your creatures already. But if you don't feel like you found your creature, that's okay, because we're going to talk about some other animals that you might have. There are so many different groups of animals in the world, and we have not gone over all of them. We won't even have the chance to go over all of them today. So we're going to discuss another category that has a lot of animals in it, but can be very complicated. Okay, so take a look at our dichotomous key. This is a section of our animal key. And this is part of our question that you probably remember earlier. So we're talking about animals without a backbone. Does your animal have 6 legs? So some of you answered yes, and you got an insect, but some of you might have answered no. So if you answered no, what kind of creatures could be in this group? So there are many, many groups that of no backbone animals that are not insects. There's no one group. It's not simple. So we're not going to go through everything today because it's very complicated, but we're just going to call them other invertebrate groups. Usually we can divide these creatures into ones that live in water and ones that live on land. Some creatures that live in water you might recognize: crabs, sea stars, seahorse. Some that live on land: spiders, slugs. So lots of different kinds of creatures here. Okay, so we're going to talk about some aquatic invertebrates. So this means no backbone animals that live in the water. They can live in rivers, they can live in lakes, they can live in the ocean. So this does not include all the groups that there are, but I have chosen some of my favorites and some of our famous groups that some of you might know. Let's start with mollusks. Mollusks is a big name used to describe creatures like octopuses, squid, shellfish, sea snails, clams, and other shellfish. So all of these animals have a shell that's made of calcium, and some have usually used some form of mucus on their bodies. Sometimes it helps them to move around. And they also have soft body tissues. So you think of a snail, and they definitely have a gooey part of their body inside that hard shell. A mollusk, no matter what, always has a shell piece, even if it's deep in their body. Like an octopus has a very small piece of shell in its body where we can't see. All of these creatures also have a tongue that has little spikes on it. This helps them to scrape for food. Okay, our next group, 2 very big words. They're called cnidarians and ctenophores, but you don't have to remember those words. We're just going to call them jellies. That's a really good way to just describe them because they are just a lot like jelly. These creatures have no bones, no complex brains, and they have arms or tentacles that can sting. So if you think of a jellyfish or an anemone, some of these creatures move in the water like a jellyfish, but some stay put pretty much their whole life like a sea anemone. So things that belong in this group are jellyfish, like I said, anemones, and even other types of jellyfish. One is called a gooseberry. This is called a crystal jelly right here. Okay, so our next group, arthropods. This is a very big group. Arthropods have hinge joints, which means that their arms and their legs kind of move like levers. These creatures also go through molting stages, which means they shed their entire skin and then they grow new ones. And this skin is very hard. It's almost like a shell covering their whole body. These creatures are also related to land insects. Land insects are also arthropods. You've probably heard of some of these animals: shrimp, crabs, lobsters, and many others are some. And one of everyone's favorite groups, echinoderms. These animals are things like sea stars and sea urchins. They have thousands upon thousands of tiny little feet on the undersides of their body. These tiny feet help them to move along the substrate. On some animals, they also have tiny little, or on all of these animals, they also have tiny spines. So this is more obvious on things like sea urchins rather than a sea star, for example. Also in this group are sea cucumbers and sand dollars. So some of you might be walking around the beach and saying, a lot of these creatures look the same. How am I supposed to tell them apart? They all look the same. So some of these shellfish, or creatures with shells in the water, can look really similar to each other. There are other kinds of shelled animals that aren't on this picture, but we'll go through some of the most common. We have mussels on our left side. Mussels are often blue, black, or gray. They are bivalves, meaning they have 2 shells. These 2 shells are connected at the base. Mussels are usually glued to their home forever using tiny little threads, but they can move if they need to. Their shells are longer than they are wide, and they are rounded at the top. They are often found exposed to water instead of being in the sand like clams. Oysters are a lot like mussels because they often remain stuck to their homes for a long time. Their shells are irregular and longer than they are wide. You can see how many bumps and ridges are on this oyster shell. They usually sit with their shells slightly open so that they can breathe and eat. Over here, we have a cockle. So a cockle is actually a type of clam. That's why it looks so similar to this other clam we have here. So their shapes almost look like a rounded triangle. Not all clams have this shape, but a lot of them do. So it's usually a good sign that you have a clam. Clams really like to bury themselves in the sand. You won't see them exposed like you would a mussel or an oyster. Next, we have a scallop. Scallops have wide, rounded shells, and the first thing you want to look for is this little rectangle at the bottom of their shell. So scallops can actually swim, and they can hide in their habitats to stay away from predators. Lastly, we're going to talk about the abalone and the limpet. These animals are closely related to each other. They're not so closely related to these other animals. So they only have one shell. They don't have two shells like these other guys. The abalone is unique because it has all these little holes along its shell ridge. And the limpet is unique because when you look at it from the top, it looks like a big oval.
Oh yeah, we got a ton of cool invertebrates that live in the sea, but there's also a bunch that live on land too. So one that you might have seen, they're called gastropods, which means something basically like mouth foot, because that's pretty much their only two parts. They've got a mouth, and then they've got this long body that's basically their foot that they use to travel around. And those are all, you're looking at snails and slugs. So if you think about the difference between a slug and an ant, you know, the ant has the different segments to its body, but the slug really only has one. If you've got a little critter that's got 4 pairs of legs, then you have an arachnid. Some common arachnids that you might know are spiders and ticks. They kind of have a similar body segmentation. They've got different segments to their body, but they don't have the right amount of legs to classify as an insect. And then you remember that in gastropod, pod means foot. So myriapod gets their name from having just so many feet. They definitely have too many to count as an insect. And you're going to be looking at, you know, millipedes and centipedes. These are your myriapods. And then the last one we're going to talk about is worms. So they're called annelids. Worm is complicated because a lot of times the babies of another type of insect might look like a worm. So it's a tricky group. You can't always identify if it's a worm just based on looking at it. All right, we got a quick little question for you guys. What do you think this is? Are you thinking this is, what do you think these are? Do you think it's an alien? Do you think it's Swiss cheese? Do you think we're looking at an ocean creature or maybe a cactus?
I think it looks like an alien.
Yeah, I think it looks like a cactus, but okay. So yeah, we got an ocean creature. Yeah, this is actually a sea urchin. So the little holes that you're seeing up in that one photo, that's where its little tube feet go. They're what hold it onto the substrate and keep it from moving around in those rough waters. And the other one is just a really close-up look at what the external shell of the sea urchin looks like. So what is a lichen? A lichen is a hybrid between an algae and a fungus. Fungus, they can't photosynthesize, so they can't make food from sunlight because they don't have a compound which is called chlorophyll. It's what makes plants green and allows them to make food from sun. So lichen has chosen to partner up with just this little tiny algae cell, which is a little plant cell, kind of just hangs out on its own, but it's green, so it does have that chlorophyll, and it's capable of photosynthesizing to make food from sunlight. So in this little relationship they've got going on, the fungi gets food, and the algae gets a safe place to live within that fungus that's protected from UV rays and other potentially damaging things in the environment. That's why you see them everywhere. They've adapted to be able to live off basically just each other, so they don't need much else in order to survive.
So some of you may have a lot of conifers around your house, around the parks you go to. You might see a lot of them, especially here in Victoria. A conifer is just a type of plant that has needles instead of leaves. So I'm sure you've all seen them through Christmas trees. Maybe you've accidentally poked your arm on one in the park. Many of us know who these guys are. There are three kinds of types of conifers that are really similar. So we're going to go through how to identify them. This is a pine tree on our left side. Pine tree is really easy because if you see needles in bundles, in 2, 3, or 5, in bundles of 2, 3, or 5, we know this is a pine tree. Needles are usually longer than other conifers as well. So to tell a pine tree apart, as long as you have bundles, it's definitely a pine tree. A spruce tree, their needles tend to be really short and really stiff and quite spiky often. The cones on them tend to be more flexible. They have lots of scales on them, and they sometimes droop off the branches. They can be arranged singly rather than in bundles like the pine tree. Fir needles tend to be a lot softer, and they extend from a single point, just like the spruce needles. They're not in clusters either. They usually have white stripes on the underside, which are sometimes hard to see because they're so small, but usually the cones of a fir tree also grow up rather than drooping down, like a pine or a spruce tree. Okay, so we have another activity for everyone. Let's remember our animals again. Go back all the way to when we were talking about backbones and no backbones. Which group does everyone think is bigger? Do you think animals with backbones like us and dogs and cats and whales, do you think that animal group is bigger? Or do you think the animals without backbones, do you think that group is bigger? There are many more no backbone animals than there are backbone animals.
This is the jawbone of a couple different animals. We're going to look at these and try and figure out a bit more information about what animal they might have come from. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the difference between a herbivore and a carnivore. A carnivore is an animal that eats meat, and a herbivore eats plants. So, we can usually classify animals based on their diet, and their body structure also has hints to tell you what kind of diet they might prefer. So these teeth are a big hint into what diet these animals might prefer. We're going to do a quick poll. We want to think, which one of these animals do you think is a carnivore? A is the carnivore. So now that we know which one's the carnivore and the herbivore, you can look a little bit more closely at that teeth structure. So you see the carnivore, the smaller of the jaws, has a lot sharper and bigger teeth, because when they eat, they need to be able to cut through tough meat to get those little bite-sized pieces so they can digest it. But when you look at that herbivore, you can see the teeth have been used totally different. The front teeth are super small, probably don't do a lot, but those back teeth are big and fairly sharp, because they need to, their food's easy enough to pull off the ground, but they really got to grind it up in order to get all the nutrition out of that. They're tough veggies. So people eat both meat and vegetables. Do we know what those are called? Carnivore. Love it. Okay, so now we know we can look at the teeth to tell about their diet. But what else can we look at? So if you're thinking about the difference between, a carnivore and a herbivore, carnivores have to actively hunt to get their food, which means they're predators and usually close to the top of the food chain. So they don't really worry too much about other animals eating them. Whereas herbivores, on the other hand, usually lower down, they're usually prey animals. So they do have to worry about keeping an eye out on predators that might be coming to choose them for their meal. So as a result, there's a little bit of difference in their skull formation. So carnivores normally have eyes set on the front of their skull. Think about us, right on the front, because they have to focus. Their food wants to leave. Their food's trying to get away. So they have to have really good visual focus on what they're looking at. Whereas a herbivore, his food's not going anywhere. It's sitting in the same spot. He doesn't have to try that hard. So if we think about that, think about the eye placement. which of these two animals now do you think is a carnivore and which is a herbivore? Animal A is the carnivore. You can see its eyes are set way more forward, whereas the other one kind of to the side so it can have a broader visual range. Okay, and does anyone have a guess as to what these animals are? He's a deer. What about A? It's a bear.
So now we're going to get into some specific species trivia. See if you can guess who these species are. Our first species is an owl. Who do you think this species is? This is a barred owl. The next species, this is a goose. Our next species, this is a king crab. Okay, so you're going to see this creature in the pail. Who do you think this is? So swimming around. This turns into a common dronefly. Who do you think this animal is? Or these animals are? There are lots of them. Looks like they were collected from the nearby water source.
Okay, mosquito.
Okay, so this creature kind of looks like a bird. What do you guys think? But let's think of some mammals that have really long snouts, maybe ones that live in the water. What are some mammals that live in the water? What do you all think? Do you think this is a bird or do you think this is a mammal that lives in the water? Okay, it is a mammal. This is, I believe it's a doll. Yeah, this is a Dall's porpoise. So remember, porpoises have those long snouts. They have very unique head shapes to help them locate food and also to communicate with each other. This is a similar concept. Are these guys a predator or prey? So what Jamie was talking about, this kind of relates to being either a carnivore or a herbivore. A lot of the time, if you're a predator, well, all the time, if you're a predator, you're going to be a carnivore. Some animals can be both. Some animals can hunt other animals and also be hunted themselves. Some animals only hunt other animals and don't have any predators. So we're going to look at some things that Jamie mentioned. Remember where the eyes are. If you can't see where the eyes are, we're going to look at the head structures of these animals. So when we think about some of the animals these could be, what things do we come up with? This is a moose and a mountain goat. Mountain goat and moose eat plants. They don't eat other animals, so they are prey. What about these guys? Remember, we want to think about the eyes, the teeth that Jamie mentioned. Do you think these animals eat other animals? Or do you think that they are hunted themselves? Do you think they could be things like deer or caribou? So this is a bear, a coyote, a grizzly, and a lynx. All predators. So they all eat other animals, they don't eat plants, and they don't really have many natural predators themselves.
Okay, now we're gonna get you guys to come up with some cool animals. So based on all that stuff you learned about different specifications and identities of species, we want you to come up with an animal and tell us about it. So if you need help coming up with one, you don't have to do this, but one way to come up with your animal is to roll a dice. It allows you to randomize what you're going to do. So if you have a dice or if you have that little dice roller we sent out, roll the first dice. If you get an odd number, you're going to pick an invertebrate. If you get an even number, you're going to make a vertebrate. On your second roll, if you're using an invertebrate, odd number, you do an insect. Even number, do another critter.
Jellyfish or...
For vertebrates, here we go. 1 mammal, 2 bird, 3 amphibian, 4 reptile, 5 fish, 6 dealer's choice.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating.
And parents and adults, follow us on social media.